Hi, everyone. We're about to get started here with our first workshop on the 9 microgram annual. And gonna walk through our how to listen to the Spanish interpretation. So on your Zoom, you should be able to navigate to access audio for the Spanish option. Make sure to mute audio when doing that. We also have slides translated into Spanish available. There'll be an option towards wherever you see it might be towards the top of your screen. You should be able to look at a different set of shared screens.
Para acceder a la interpretación al español, si está conectado en Zoom, si está en un computador o en un móvil, busque los 3 puntos para más y el menú dice interpretación. De ahí escoja español y finalizado si es que está en un móvil. If you would like to hear English interpretation, you choose the English channel at the 3 dots for more.
Thank you. I want to welcome everyone for participating in our first workshop on the designation process for the 9 microgram annual PM 2.5 standard and kicking off the SIP development. This is a very important process. This EPA set the 9 microgram standard at a level to protect public health. We want to make sure that people are involved in the process as we designate areas throughout California. And so I will now pass it to Mark Hickson, who is leading this project.
Great, thank you, Sylvia. And thanks to everyone for attending. This is what we envision as the first in a series of workshops focused on this new PM 2.5 standard. Sylvia said this is for the 9 microgram annual PM 2.5 standard. And I will walk through, I'll skip through the audio language slides. So what we're going to cover today is the setting of the new PM 2.5 standard. What is that? What does this mean for areas of California? And we want to go through the process where areas are designated for the new standard. So once you've set a new standard, you have to determine which areas are exceeding the new standard. We'll then walk through the process by which you attain the new standard. So how do areas eventually meet the new standard once they've been designated? And we also think it's important with this set of workshops and this new standard, it's a chance to look at our public engagement around the national ambient air quality standards. And we also have a section trying to better describe our understanding of PM 2.5. So what contributes to the PM 2.5 problem in California? And then from there, we'll talk through the steps that we have following this workshop. So the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, sometimes we call this the NAAQS in short. I'll try to avoid the acronyms as much as possible. There's a lot in this line of work. So the US EPA, they set the limits on certain pollutants emitted into the outdoors. There are 6 pollutants specifically covered by the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. And these pollutants are harmful to public health and the environment. That's why they've been identified and they have limits set under this standard. And as part of this process, EPA, they not only set the standard, but they also set up a timeline for how they review the standard. So every 5 years, EPA will convene panelists to review new scientific and technical information to see if the standard as it's set is as health protective as it should be based on our new understanding. So this new PM 2.5 standard, it was finalized February 7th, 2024. It was revised to 9 micrograms per meter cubed, down from the previous standard set at 12 micrograms per meter cubed. And this is an annual standard. So you're looking at the PM 2.5 concentrations over the course of a year. When this standard was revised, there were no changes to any of the other particulate matter standards. So PM 2.5, the annual standard, is just one of a few different particulate matter standards that EPA sets. And specifically, they only revised the annual standard in this, this round of reviews. So when we're talking about particulate matter, for this standard, we're specifically talking about those fine particulate matter particles. So they're very small. It's PM 2.5. That 2.5 describes the diameter of these particles in the air. They're very small, much smaller than a human hair, much smaller even than a grain of sand. PM 2.5, it's composed of both solid and liquid droplets that are suspended in the air. And PM 2.5 can come directly from sources. So there are some sources that just directly emit PM 2.5 into the air. But PM 2.5, it can also form in the atmosphere from other gases. So I have a list here on the slide of the common, what we call precursor gases that can form PM 2.5 in the atmosphere. We have oxides of nitrogen, ammonia, oxides of sulfur, and volatile organic compounds. So it's a complex pollutant that can have many different types of sources that contribute to it. And the reason we care about PM 2.5 specifically is that it has known adverse health effects, specifically on the lungs and heart of people, but there are other health effects that are also known. And as you look at the criteria pollutant standard updates, more information that's available tends to lead towards lowering of these standards over time as we understand them better and their impacts on the human body. So with the new PM 2.5 standard, we have opportunities in addition to the role we play in protecting public health by reducing PM 2.5 concentrations. When you set a new standard, you look freshly at your potential sources of pollution in an area to see, have things changed since the last time we've either reviewed a PM standard, or if this is a new area that has never been designated for non-attainment before, you may be looking at the mix of sources in the area for the first time. So it's an opportunity to deepen our understanding of the sources of pollution in an area. For those areas that may have been designated for a previous standard, it's a chance to look back at control strategies to see what might be effective in reducing PM 2.5 for this new standard. And over time, through the application of new control strategies on pollution sources, the pollution burden in a region is reduced, and that burden on specific communities that suffer the most from air pollution, their exposure to those PM concentrations are reduced as well. In addition, the controls strategies that are put in place to control one pollutant, often those have additional benefits. So as we look at controls on PM 2.5, you may also have co-benefits for things like ozone, greenhouse gases, and toxics as well. So the set of events that were kicked off with the standard being revised in February this year, 2024, that kicks off a set of events. These are established in the Clean Air Act for how this process works. Once EPA establishes a new standard for any pollutants, we're focused here on PM 2.5, but anytime the standard is revised, states are then given 1 year to recommend areas that will be designated non-attainment for this new standard. So the state will review air quality data over the course of the year in order to recommend areas that are exceeding this new standard by February 7th of 2025. CARB will review the air quality data to also look at things like exceptional events, the completeness of the data, in order to make the best recommendations we can for areas that are exceeding the new standard. Once we've provided EPA those recommendations, they will then respond back to the recommendations. This next step will be in October, mid-October 2025, EPA responds back to our recommendations, what's called a 120-day letter. And that kicks off a process that allows for public comments and the state to respond back to EPA's changes to our recommendations, if any. The other thing that happens with that is our initial recommendations that we make February of next year, that's based on the air quality data we have on hand right now through the end of 2023. More air quality data will be available once EPA responds to our recommendations, and you'll have 2024 air quality data that can be incorporated into that review. So at that time, there'll be more air quality data that can be used to make determinations about the designation of areas. And then after that, once we have areas designated, those areas that exceed the new standard will have 18 months, a year and a half to draft state implementation plans. So these are plans that provide a pathway towards attaining the standard, with that attainment date for these areas being December 31st of 2032. And in the world of the PM standards, all of these areas are classified a certain way. And initially areas for the PM SIPs are classified as moderate. And over time that classification can change, but that's one of the differences between the PM 2.5 standard and the ozone standards, where in ozone, you may have different classifications initially. For PM, all the areas start out as what's called moderate classification. Next, I want to go through the process of designating areas. So we've talked through the standard, the lowering of the standard, the major milestones that come about from setting the standard and then eventually attaining the standard. But we're in this phase now where we're going through designations for areas. And so designations occur based on air quality data. The number that's used to compare against the air quality standard is called a design value. And for this standard, it's an annual standard. So we need an annual design value to compare against the 9 microgram standard. And the design value itself is actually just an average of 3 years of annual data. So for 2023, the design value would be the average of 2021, 2022, and 2023. And I put a very simple example in the slide to show if you have a value of 8 in 2021, a value of 9 in 2022, and a value of 10 in 2023, the average of that is 9. And the way the standard works, if you are at the standard, you're in attainment. So a value of 9 would be just attaining the 9 microgram standard. The other important thing to note on the design value is that the data used for design values can come only from those monitors that meet certain requirements. These are called federal reference monitors or federal equivalent monitors. There are other sensors and types of monitors out in the world, but the monitors used to assess the designations and attainment of the standards must meet certain requirements. For 2023, we've already looked at which areas are exceeding the 9 microgram standard, and this map and the table alongside of it shows those areas where our 2023 design value, again, that's the average of 21, 22, and 23 annual averages, shows values over the 9 microgram standard. So from north to south, we've got Mendocino, Portola, Yuba City, Marysville, Bay Area, Sacramento, San Joaquin Valley, South Coast, San Diego, and Imperial. The other thing to note on this initial, on this data is that for these areas, we've not looked at removing what are called exceptional events. We're going to talk about that in a minute. What are exceptional events? How do they impact the standard? And for our recommendations, we base our assessment of the designations on these 2023 design values. Eventually, we'll have 2024 data that will be included in the final designations that EPA makes next in 2026. I briefly mentioned exceptional events. The exceptional events they're important to consider when we're looking at the design values and any regulatory action. So by regulatory action, we're talking about things like designating an area as non-attainment or an area coming into attainment once it's has reduced its pollution significantly enough that it will attain a standard. And so we really look at these very narrowly in that we're looking at these in specific situations where the attainment or designation of an area is impacted by something like a wildfire or a high wind event, something that's natural or maybe unpredictable or not controllable by the area. And it's important to note that the SIP itself is focused on what the area itself and the state can do to control the sources of pollution in that specific area. And so things like a wildfire may fall outside of the control of an area to reduce its pollution and come into attainment. And so we go through a process of reviewing exceptional events to see, well, do they impact the designation or attainment of an area before we go into the work of actually what's called a demonstration for the exceptional events. And we have an example here. So for this round of designations for Siskiyou County, we looked at exceptional events from 2021 and 2022. There were 50 days in 2021 and 7 days in 2022 that caused their design value for 2023 to be over the 9 microgram standard. So their initial design value before looking at exceptional events is 11.7 micrograms per meter cubed. Once those days are reviewed and removed, you have a design value of 8.2. And there's a significant amount of work that goes into successfully demonstrating that the impacts of these specific events were the cause of this area being over the standard. And so you only work with EPA to approve as many days as you need to be below the standard, in this case, the 9 microgram standard. Now that you have your design values for areas, you've looked at exceptional events, the next step in the designation process is that We look at the boundaries for the areas that have exceeded the air quality standard. And EPA prescribes a what they call a 5-factor analysis. It's a weight of evidence approach where you look at data from air quality, not just the monitors used to designate an area, although that's your starting point, but you might look at other air quality data, like maybe air quality sensors or things of that nature that weren't used to designate the area, but may help you understand where the sources are that are contributing to the exceedance of the air quality standard. You also look at your emission sources to see which sources are potentially impacting your monitors in the area. And then factors like meteorology and geography and topography help you understand the transportation of emissions from outside of the area that may be affecting the monitor. And lastly, there's a consideration for jurisdictional boundaries that may be beneficial in implementing control strategies. These factors are uniquely considered for each area. For this new standard, we have some pre-existing boundaries for areas that will likely be used. And then you have new areas that have not gone through this process of designation before, that these factors need to be considered when drawing the boundary for the non-attainment area. After you have your boundaries, you've made your recommendations, and you then have a final designation for an area, there's a process for how these areas meet an air quality standard. For that process, there's multiple agencies at play here. We have EPA that sets the standards and also reviews the plans for attaining the standard. EPA also has control over regulating certain sources, interstate transport sources. CARB, the state, we have control over developing the state implementation plans that are the framework for how we attain the standard. We work with the Air District on these plans, and CARB has a role in regulating the mobile sources, greenhouse gases, consumer products, and working with the air districts on developing and adopting the SIPs, the state implementation plans. The Air District has local control over area sources in their districts. They are regulating stationary sources, things like fireplaces, power plants, factories, and they also will develop control measures that are put in place for those specific sources and work with the state on developing and drafting the SIP. So I've said the word SIP a few times. That's our state implementation plan. That's the framework for how you go from being designated non-attainment to eventually attaining the standard. And the SIP incorporates different elements in order to demonstrate that an area will come into attainment for a given air quality standard. The beginning of it is the air quality monitoring, just the same as the designation process itself. You need to know the concentrations of the pollutants here, PM 2.5 in an area, in order to understand the nature of the problem. And from there, you build an emissions inventory so you can catalog and understand the sources that are contributing to PM 2.5 in an area. We also have, from there, air quality modeling that works to tie our understanding of the emission sources to the concentrations of PM 2.5. And it also helps us understand how effective reducing emissions from certain sources will be at eventually attaining the standard. And then lastly, once you have the air quality modeling inventory and the monitoring itself, you can put together control strategies and test them out with your air quality model to see just what strategy is going to work in order to bring an area to attain the standard. I shared earlier a set of milestones tied to the new standard. Here, I'm breaking down what is the timeline for developing a SIP itself. So we have the same starting point as that previous slide on milestones, where the standard comes out in February 7th of 2024. We're still going through this designation process right now, but considering how much effort is involved in updating the emission inventory, the air quality modeling, updating rules for a new SIP, we've actually started the work on developing the SIP already to put in place those updates for the emission inventory that will be needed to develop the SIP. And by the time the designations are finalized in February 2026, we'll be well on our way through updating the emissions inventory that then feeds into the air quality modeling. That first air quality modeling is something that we do to first test that we're representing the emissions and the concentrations well in the model. From there, we go through a process of evaluating the rules that are in place at both the state and district level to see what might be needed additionally in order to bring an area into attainment. From there, you put together an attainment demonstration that takes your control strategy that you've developed, tests it with the air quality model to see if you can successfully bring the area into attaining the new standard. And then there's a process at both the district and state level to go through board hearings to present this plan, state implementation plan for each area that needs to attain the standard. And that's all then due to EPA in the last quarter of 2027. One thing that we've been thinking about a lot with this new standard is how to approach public engagement. And I see this as an opportunity where there's a bit of, not a reset, but we have a fresh start with the standard. So let's take a look at how we can approach public engagement throughout this process. And again, we're starting now where we're in this phase of designations, and we'll eventually move into the state implementation plan process. I think it's important that we take a look at feedback that we've received from past efforts in this space. And things that we're hearing are to make collaboration and engagement happen earlier, make it happen more consistently, more engagement with the stakeholders, hearing feedback, identifying are there opportunities for workshops, working with districts to have, say, local workshops, and making sure that we provide information earlier so that there's time to actually take feedback and incorporate it into the plans that we have. One thing that we've committed to as of this past summer is that starting next year, we will be restarting what our annual board updates on really across the state, the status of PM 2.5 and ozone. And so that's one part of that effort that we see as addressing concerns around public engagement. And also, we want to make this process as much as possible something that is iterative, where we can work with you and get your feedback so that the next workshop can build on this and so on. And we're open to ideas, like what would make sense for the types of workshops that we hold. This structure that we're doing today is a starting point, but I don't see this as being the template for how we have to do every subsequent workshop. We can consider alternative formats that maybe foster better engagement. I do think it's on us to consider what is our part to play in making sure that engagement is as easy and as consistent as possible. just a few of the opportunities that we're seeing from this vantage point. The workshop series is one of them. I flagged the emission inventory and control strategy workshop specifically, that one of our future workshops will be on the inventories. Eventually, we'll also have workshops on control strategies. I think these are areas that are really ripe for public input and engagement on. The designations themselves, so our recommendations to EPA will be going to our board in January of 2025. That's another opportunity to engage. Eventually, district workshops, whether they are about this standard or other standards or actions at the district. I think those are opportunities. I'm not flagging a specific one here, but it's something to keep an eye on as an opportunity. And generally, any CARB regulatory board hearings, if there's a subject that you're interested in or want to engage with more, that's another place to look to be more active in engaging. And then bringing it back to this specific set of designations for this standard, in October of next year, there will be a 30-day public comment period for designations. Again, the timing's not exact. It really depends on when EPA releases their 120-day notice. But that'll be another opportunity about this standard specifically for engagement. And lastly, the board hearings that occur around the SIPs themselves, although those are late in the process again, but those are opportunities for more engagement. We wanted to also flag things for you to maybe take away from this, for ideas, for things that you can do. Again, we've talked a bit about participation in the workshops and hearings, where you feel comfortable to providing ideas and feedback. We'll also have some material on our very last slide, opportunities for you to, or really avenues for you to provide that feedback. When there are chances to do so with your local air district, that's another place for active participation. I know our website has some educational materials and updates, announcements. Those are places to start to look for more information. And then considerations for, if you're thinking of, well, what can I personally do about air pollution? For me, it starts with noticing how I use certain appliances or my vehicle, and just start noticing that, and then considering, well, is there an alternative way to use that appliance? Is there, a cleaner way for me to say, wash my clothes or drive my car or something like that? But there are potential avenues there to make personal choices that can impact air quality as well. And then very specifically on wood stoves and fireplaces, they're very important to consider for PM 2.5. Many of the air districts may have like alerts around curtailment programs or no burn days that you can receive notifications for in order to know if it's a particularly good day or not to use that device. So I'm going to pass the baton here to James.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so in the following slides, I will present how we can utilize different observing systems to understand PM 2.5 pollution in California, to help verify and improve our emission inventory for PM 2.5 and its precursors, and to guide the development of control strategies. Next slide, please. Let's start with a short outline of my presentation. I will first describe the typical sources that contribute to PM 2.5 in California. And then I will show how observations of PM 2.5 composition, as well as seasonal and diurnal variations, can provide information about PM 2.5 sources. I will also give examples of how we leverage different measurements and research studies to identify organic aerosol sources and to identify potential gaps in the emissions inventory. Next slide, please. Many different sources contribute to ambient PM 2.5. This slide displays an example of PM 2.5 compositions at Los Angeles in 2021, along with the types of emission sources that contribute to each component. PM 2.5 is primarily composed of organic aerosol, elemental carbon, ammonium, nitrate, sulfate, dust, and sea salt. The most abundant component is organic aerosol, which originates from sources such as wood burning and commercial cooking. The next most abundant component is nitrate, which is also associated with ammonium. Nitrate is formed from NOx emitted by sources such as motor vehicles, and from ammonia, which primarily comes from dairies, fertilizer usage, as well as on-road sources. Sulfate is formed from sulfur dioxide, which is mainly associated with the stationary sources, and also ammonia. Elemental carbon is a smaller component and is emitted from sources such as older diesel trucks. Wind-blown fugitive dust contributes to the dust portion of PM 2.5, while sea salt is important near the ocean. I will note that I have just shown examples of sources that contribute to each PM 2.5 component. But in reality, there are many more sources that contribute. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to shift to discussing some of the different measurement platforms we can use to investigate sources of PM 2.5 and to verify and improve the emission inventory. California has an extensive ground-based routine monitoring network that measures PM 2.5 mass, PM 2.5 composition, and precursors pollutants. During special field campaigns, aircraft and ships are deployed to provide observations above ground and over water that are typically not covered by the regulatory network. During field campaigns, research-grade instruments are utilized to provide detailed measurements that routine monitors can't provide. Finally, satellite-based instruments provide measurements with broader spatial coverage for specific pollutants. Next slide, please. California has a PM 2.5 speciation monitoring network that measures PM 2.5 composition across the state. The red diamonds on the map indicate the location of these monitors. This slide also shows 2021 annual PM 2.5 composition at select locations across the state, including Los Angeles, San Diego, and Calexico in Southern California, Bakersfield and Sacramento in Central California, San Jose in the Bay Area, and Portola in Northern California. As you can see, PM2.5 composition varies across the state. In general, organic aerosol, represented in green in the pie charts, is the most abundant component across California. However, despite the similar appearance of the annual PM2.5 composition at some sites, such as Los Angeles and Bakersfield, the nature and sources of PM2.5 can vary greatly. So in the following slides, we will show more detail about PM2.5 in Los Angeles, Bakersfield, and Portola. Next slide, please. This slide shows monthly PM2.5 composition at Bakersfield on the left and at Los Angeles on the right. While annual PM2.5 composition appeared similar at these two sites as shown in the previous slide, monthly composition can be very different, suggesting different sources and meteorological conditions are contributing to PM2.5 at the two sites, which may require different control strategies to reduce PM2.5 in each region. Next slide, please. This slide shows the hourly PM2.5 patterns at Portola on the left and at Bakersfield on the right. Each plot displays the hourly PM2.5 concentrations measured on December 21st, 2022. The daily averages at these two sites are both close to 40 micrograms per cubic meter. However, Portola exhibited stronger diurnal variation, likely due to the influence of local residential wood combustion emissions. In contrast, Bakersfield showed less diurnal variation, pointing to more widespread regional pollution from ammonium nitrate and organic aerosol emissions. These differences in diurnal trends can help clarify the nature of the PM2.5 problem and identify potential sources contributing to the elevated PM2.5 levels. Next slide, please. This slide demonstrates how research field campaigns can be utilized to understand the sources of organic aerosol, the most abundant PM2.5 component annually. Generally, field studies employ research-grade instruments that offer additional information not obtained from the regulatory monitoring network. For example, the aerosol mass spectrometer shown in the picture can measure detailed organic composition, allowing for the identification of various organic aerosol sources, such as cooking, mobile sources, and biomass burning. The two pie charts provided examples of organic aerosol source determination based on wintertime measurements in Fresno and summertime measurements in Oakland. Next slide, please. This slide presents another example of using field studies to verify and understand PM2.5 and its precursors. CARB has funded various airborne field campaigns over the years, including the study shown here, which was conducted by UC Berkeley researchers to measure and quantify emission fluxes of PM2.5 and ozone precursors in the South Coast and San Joaquin Valley air basins. aircraft measurements are extremely expensive and are limited in time, but can provide better spatial coverage compared to routine air monitoring. The emission fluxes quantified by the study can be used to verify and improve the graded emission inventory used in SIP modeling. Next slide, please. Space-based remote sensing measurements from satellites are capable of providing spatially resolved measurements that can be compared to the emission inventory and air quality modeling output. Due to their broad spatial coverage, satellites can help identify bias in the emission inventory, locate missing sources, and detect errors in the locations of emission sources. So the plot on the right shows an example of NO2 measurements by a satellite. Next slide, please. The following two slides provide an example of how we use satellite-based observations to inform inventory improvements for ammonia emissions in the San Joaquin Valley. The top plot in this slide shows annual average ammonia satellite measurements for the year 2017. The bottom plot displays our modeled ammonia for the same year. The modeled spatial distributions closely resemble satellite observations, indicating higher ammonia concentrations in areas of the San Joaquin Valley where dairies and fertilizer usage are concentrated. However, the modeled ammonia levels are lower than satellite observations, pointing to the need for inventory updates. Next slide, please. This slide shows similar satellite observations and model output for the year 2021. For this modeling, we incorporated preliminary updates to the dairy ammonia emission inventory, which were discussed at the August 22nd Dairy Sector Workshop. Following this update, the 2021 modeled ammonia concentrations align much better with satellite observations and better represent peak ammonia levels in the Central Valley. Next slide, please. In this slide, the left plot shows the satellite observed NO2 levels for 2021, while the right shows modeled NO2 for the same year. In general, we see that the spatial distribution revealed by the satellite measurements is well represented by the modeling. However, there are areas where the model shows positive or negative biases, which can differ from urban to rural regions. These differences will help to focus our efforts on updates to the inventory. Next slide, please. So in summary, sources contributing to PM2.5 can vary substantially across the state and during different seasons. Therefore, emission control strategies should be tailored to specific locations because there is not a one-size-fits-all solution. We have utilized and will continue to utilize different observation platforms to inform updates to the emission inventory for both PM2.5 and its precursors, which is the foundation for developing effective emission control policies. This concludes my presentation, and I will hand it back over to Mark.
Great, thank you, James.
Thank you, Mark.
To wrap up, I want to go through a few of our next steps that we have planned Right now, we're working on the boundaries for the areas that we will recommend for designation for non-attainment. We're working on emission inventory updates to understand the important sources in areas, especially those with limited monitoring. Also reviewing air quality data that we have available to see if there are any information in that to point us to significant sources in areas that are going to be newly designated. We're also working through with the districts, with a working group that we have in order to go through this designation process and the SIP updates. And we want to work with the stakeholders and advocates throughout this process, not only for the designations, but throughout the rest of the state implementation plan process. And for our next workshop that we have coming up, we'll be discussing emission inventory updates. And then in a future workshop after that, closer to the development of the state implementation plans, we would also want to provide more information on air quality modeling. Just a preview for our December 2024 workshop. We will have our recommendations for the non-attainment areas so that we can provide those along with the boundaries for the non-attainment areas. We will be discussing emission inventory updates that are being made for this next round of state implementation plans. We'll discuss the categories that are being updated, and it's a good opportunity, I think, to get feedback on those updates. And one last slide before we go into questions. We have a website that we posted. It was also included in the notice. This will be our landing page for materials related to this 9 microgram PM 2.5 standard. We have a couple of links out from there to educational videos or resources from EPA on the new standard. We want to make the workshop recordings and the slides themselves, I think, are actually available now on the website. And we have a SIP planning email. So in order to give us feedback on the workshops, on this process, we'd love to have you use that email address and submit comments, questions, feedback to us there. And then I'd also urge you to interact with your local air district's websites to see if there are opportunities and resources there posted about the new standard. And as we go through these workshop series, your comments and our responses to those comments will be something ongoing that we want to keep revisiting throughout the process to make sure that we're being responsive and that you are being heard by us. And with that, I want us to shift into questions and comments. And I think we had a couple in the chat that we wanted to start with. Laura or Sylvia, I'm not sure. Are you in a position to read those?
Yes, I can. Thanks, Mark. So we have a few questions that folks have typed into the Q&A, and we also have some participants with hands raised. If you do have a question, please go ahead and raise your hand and we will unmute you. But let's go first to the questions that are typed in the Q&A. We'll go through the first 3 here. So I'll read the first one out. In the SIP pyramid diagram that was in the slides, why is the air quality modeling prioritized first over the monitoring? Mark, maybe that's something you could clarify.
I think I missed that. I'll navigate back to that one quick. I think that might be a typo. Just the slide, Laura?
Yeah, I think that's it. And I think maybe it's just a question about, you know, whether the pyramid is a prioritization or if it's just showing the sequence of events.
No, you're right. Yeah, it's not really saying that one of these is more important than the other. It really is a layer upon layer building on itself. So we start by understanding the nature of the problem initially through air quality modeling. We build on that through our understanding of the emission inventories. And then we then incorporate air quality modeling to further understand how the emissions connect to the concentrations. But it's not to really say that any one item is more important than the other. They all work together. If anyone else wants to comment on that in the room, feel free.
No, that sounds about right, Mark.
Thanks, Sylvia.
All right, thanks. So we've got two questions that have to do with exceptional events. So I'll read those out together, and then I think, Sylvia, you're set to answer those. So the first question was, what's the criteria for excluding days for the PM design value? And the second question was, I'm guessing that the exceptional events demonstration timeline runs concurrently with the activities to establish the non-attainment recommendations to EPA by February 7th, 2025. Is that correct?
So for the first question, what's the criteria to exclude days for the designation design value? We only excluded wildfire days that impacted whether someone met or did not meet the standard. And so for that case, there was only one area in California that was in Shasta County. And actually, if we were to look at all the wildfire impacts, the design value would actually be lower, but EPA in their process will only approve enough to get it to 9 micrograms. But I do want to let people know that when they look at our air quality data online, that data that's shown online does not discount the design value with exceptional events. So when you're looking at Shasta County data online, it'll show exactly how high it was so that people know what the value was and what they were breathing during that year. On the second question, I'm guessing that exceptional events runs concurrently. That is correct. We are working on the exceptional events for those data that impact the 2023 design value. And so we will be working concurrently with that process, and those are required to be submitted to EPA at the same deadline as designation. Again, these exceptional event documentations will go through their own public process, and we will definitely let everyone know that's interested in designations about this. However, there will be a second set of exceptional events documentation. If needed, we will do. There's a due date. If there are exceptional events like wildfire days that impact the 2024 design value, then we're required to submit those to EPA by September 30th of 2025 in order for them to be considered as part of designations. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Sylvia. All right, so we have two participants with their hands raised. So I'll go ahead and allow our first participant to unmute. Ian Faluna, you should be able to unmute and begin.
Hi, yes, thank you so much. I wanted to bring up a few points. The first is that I noticed in the presentation you showed annual composition, but you also made the point that, yes, it changes seasonally, which is very important. But one thing I noticed is that when this new standard is applied, the 9 microgram, you're going to get places, for example, like Banning and Palm Springs, which may exceed the threshold, be in non-attainment, but they are so in the photochemical regime, that is the summertime peak. So I just think it's really important to keep in mind as to which site, where are the extreme values. And it used to be that most of the time it was wintertime events in most places, but there are going to be places now that will have a summertime peak in PM that might be in exceedance. So just that's one thing. The other thing is, I mean, I'm interested in the studies to improve emissions inventories, but ammonia, of course, is the least critical of all of them because it doesn't seem to be the limiting reagent. So we have published a paper in Environmental Research Letters, my group, Wang et al., 2023, that showed satellite from NO2 study across California. And it showed that in rural places, the long-term trends, the last 10 years or so, have been zero. There's no trend outside of urban areas. Urban areas, it's still decreasing by 4+% per year, but in the rural areas, the shrublands and the croplands, there's been no change despite regulatory improvements. And I noticed that in one of the slides, you also showed that the model versus satellite NO2 didn't match in rural regions. And I believe that's because you were systematically underestimating the soil emissions in those agricultural regions. I know I sound like a broken record. I've said this before to the community, but I think it's really important. I noticed that you reference UC Berkeley, you reference the Young et al. Paper, from which I believe is Professor Zhang from UC Davis. But those are CARB funded research. And there's a lot of literature out there that's not CARB funded that I see is very germane to this issue. And one is that we have a paper, my group has a paper, Lieb et al. In Nature Scientific Reports that's in review right now that makes an estimation from nitrogen isotopes in the Imperial Valley that shows that over about a third of the NOx in that air is on an annual basis is coming from soil emissions. And again, because of the warm climates in Southern California, those soil emissions are going to be high year round, whether the PM problem is wintertime or summertime. So I think you're going to have to really keep your eye on the ball for us to get below 9. We're going to need to consider seasonality, and we're also going to need to consider this, what I believe to be a severely underestimated source coming from agricultural soils. And so just to leave with that, I just want to say that Wang et al. Study in Environmental Research Letters used OMI satellites, but we also showed a little bit of tropomi, but it was a shorter time period, so you couldn't get a long-term trend. And we focused on the warm season because we were interested in ozone. But that analysis could easily be extended to the winter time, where I think most of the places are going to have the problematic PM levels. Anyway, so I just wanted to make all those points, and thank you for letting me contribute.
Thanks, Ian. All right, I'll unmute the next speaker who has their hand raised. Christian, you should be able to unmute.
Hi, good evening, Christian in the Central Valley. I was curious if you could point me to where the designation process is. Just looking at the CFRs or the Clean Air Act, I wasn't finding that section. I was curious if the initial moderate designation was a requirement, and then knowing that the state or local entity can be more stringent in certain aspects when it comes to air quality, given like the status for San Joaquin Valley example, has not met the 1997 or 2012 standard yet. Could you choose to make the initial designation greater than moderate, given that they're on extensions for meeting the serious designations?
This is Sylvia Vanderspeck. I can go ahead and ask that question. The Clean Air Act is fairly clear. It's 186. It's something right around there, but there's a specific section on the PM standard, and it's very specific that everyone is first initially classified as moderate. Now, as you mentioned, that San Joaquin's already classified as serious. That's not going to change. They're not going to be reclassified to moderate for those previous standards. They're still serious for those standards. But the Clean Air Act is very clear that everyone's classified as moderate. You've got 6 years to attain, by 2032. You must develop a state implementation plan with reasonable measures that either show that you attain the standard or you don't. And then there's a specific process. I can tell you that for the last SIP, we kind of tried to do it the other way, where we wanted to bump up the serious, right at the get-go for the San Joaquin SIP. During that process, EPA indicated to us that they must follow what's specified in the Clean Air Act, that you're moderate. and they bump you up, then they require a serious SIP. And so what happened is, over that long time period, those serious SIPs that we originally developed were no longer, many of the assumptions made in it were out of date and things had changed. So we do agree, that we think that, doing a SIP right away and showing attainment as quickly as possible is very important. And we'll definitely be working really hard across the state to make sure that, the controls are in place at all of the areas that are going to be designated as moderate.
And quick follow-up, would it be possible after the moderate designation is made that in a very short time frame, say a year, CARB recommend to the board that they reclassify as serious sooner, or is that not possible?
I mean, what we could do, what you could do, because it's EPA that does the reclassification. And so what we could do is urge EPA to act on those moderate SIPs quicker. They're supposed to act on them within 18 months after you submit them, and they many times don't do that. And so if EPA were to act a little bit quicker on these SIPs, then we could actually get the serious SIPs and get those controls in place. I do want to highlight, though, that even though an area is, not meeting the moderate attainment deadline and is getting bumped up to serious, they're working on that SIP. They're working on the modeling, they're working on the control strategy. And so work just doesn't stop. And so I think that's important to note also.
Okay, thank you.
And just jumping back to Ian's comments, I did want to say thank him for his comments, because I think he raises some important issues. And Ian, I don't know if you're still on, but if you are, I'd love to get a copy of the most recent publications that you were referencing. I'm not sure if I've seen those, but we definitely like to get a copy of them if you can.
Yeah, just give me the email to direct them to. I'd gladly do.
All right, I'll shoot you an email offline.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, perfect.
All right, thanks. So we'll go ahead and go back to the chat and take a couple of questions from there too. We had a question about OA contribution. So the question is, it seems that Portola has approximately 80% OA contribution to PM 2.5 as compared to all the other regions where the OA contribution is approximately 40%. Is there a particular emission source contributing to this discrepancy?
This is Sylvia Vanderspeck. I think I can answer that question. So in Portela, there is a very unique nature there. The annual problem is driven by home heating due to wood stoves. And so that region is a small valley. It has an inversion layer. And so when people, and it's at a high elevation that gets snow and cold weather. And so people are using wood stoves to heat their homes. And so that's what's really causing the pollution problem there. They are working really hard to turn over these dirty EPA certified, old, not uncertified stoves, and changing those out. So there is an opportunity to improve air quality there.
Thanks, Sylvia. Okay, moving on to the next question. This one had to do with monitors and the distribution of monitors. Question is, I saw some smaller areas with more monitors. What determines how many monitors and where they get placed? Also, what's preventing more monitoring from happening?
Hi, this is Allie Kindred, and I can answer that question. So the monitors that are placed throughout the state, there is some requirements like metropolitan statistical areas. So depending on population, those monitors do get placed. However, the state of California does have one of the most robust monitoring networks throughout the state. The regulatory monitors are, high tech. They do require a lot of QA and QC. And in addition, we do have a lot of community air monitoring sensors. So like the purple airs, we do have a website too that contains all of that information in addition to all of the regulatory monitors that are out there. So hopefully that answers the question. Thank you.
Thanks, Allie. All right. We have another participant with hand raised, so let's jump over there and then we'll come back to the remaining questions that are in the Q&A. All right, Laura, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Hi, I have a bit of two questions, if I may. One, it was I recall you guys mentioning that through your guys' evaluation, you're only looking at your guys' monitors because they have certain requirements. So one, it was where can I find information about what those requirements are? And the reason for me asking that is kind of with the previous question of the community monitors. Would there be perhaps like a potential to be able to integrate that community monitoring into the monitoring that you guys are getting done? And then the second question is a little bit on a different note, but it's in regards to pesticides, specifically fumigants, which I think had been more regulated by the Department of Pesticides. But unfortunately, I've been seeing that there's been cutbacks in the amounts of monitoring, and fumigants do their volatile organic compounds, which do contribute to the PM 2.5. So my question is, will that continue to be only monitored by the Department of Pesticides? And if so, how can we ensure to add more monitoring when we were seeing that the monitors kept showing higher and higher levels of toluene and other fumigants in the air? And how can we ensure that there is more monitoring, considering that we're seeing those levels continue to go up? So how can we ensure that the pollution from pesticides is being included? And is that fully under PR, or will you guys be monitoring any of that, considering it's also PM 2.5? Thank you.
Okay, so this is Allie Kindred again. There were a couple of questions in there. I'm gonna try to remember and answer the first couple ones as best I can. So the monitoring requirements are part of, or they're spelled out, I should say, in the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations. So all of the specifics are there. I don't know what the reference in the CFR is off the top of my head, but we can certainly find that out for you. And then I think the second part of your question was asking about, the purple air monitors and how those are kind of incorporated to some of the decisions that we make. And so we are required to use the regulatory monitors in our decision making. That's just part of the requirements, that's part of the rules, but we do take into consideration those purple airs. So, when we're looking at areas and kind of trying to understand, the sources and, what's happening in different communities and whatnot, we are taking all of that into consideration. And as I mentioned in the last question, there is the AQ View website that has a lot of that information. I think it actually incorporates both community monitoring and maybe some regulatory information as well. So hopefully that answers the questions, and I'm going to see if somebody here wants to answer more on the pesticide piece.
Sure. Thank you so much with your comments on pesticide monitoring. At this time, we don't have an answer to your question. The pesticide monitoring is done by DPR and CARB together. And, we do think it is important. I don't know how those monitors are set up. I don't know. Michael?
This is Michael Benjamin. I'm Chief of the Air Quality Planning and Science Division at CARB. Laura, so we really hear your question about monitoring of pesticides. We recognize that it's an important issue, and we are working very closely with the Department of Pesticide Regulation to continue to evaluate what the most effective monitoring program is for pesticides. It is a very resource intensive effort to do pesticide monitoring. And so it's very useful for us to hear from you and other community members about where you think there are needs when it comes to strengthening the pesticide monitoring network. And so please do reach out to us. Let us know where you think it can be strengthened, and we will work with DPR to try to see what can be done. But thanks for raising that. Pesticides aren't a significant source of PM 2.5, and so it's not going to be addressed explicitly within this series of SIPs, but I'm really glad you brought up your concerns. Thank you.
All right, thanks for those responses. All right, I'll move ahead to another question in the chat. This one has to do with conformity. The question is, when should MPOs expect that they will need to demonstrate conformity with the new PM 2.5 standards?
You know, this is Sylvia. I apologize, you do not know the answer to that question. We can definitely get back to you on that. And so we can take a look at the chat and come back on that one.
All right, the next question in the chat has to do with airborne field measurements. How do the space measurements with aircrafts work, and how accurate are those in regards to time, given that air quality can vary over time and depending on weather? Also, how frequent are those types of assessments done?
I can answer that. This is Jeremy Avis, Chief of the Modeling and Meteorology Branch. So there's always trade-offs depending on what measurement platform you're working on. In terms of satellite-based measurements, we're getting those daily, sometimes a couple times a day, depending on the satellite and what pollutant species we're looking at. And certainly there are considerations with using that, right? You get a snapshot in time, you get roughly all of California, which provides a lot of information, but you don't get information about how pollution is changing throughout the day. And so we typically will look at not just say a single measurement platform like the satellites, but we'll combine that with surface measurements where we can actually get diurnal profiles. So we're not just looking at a single type of measurement in isolation, right? We're combining it with all other measurement platforms that are available to us. And that's, I think, similar with the aircraft measurements, where the aircraft measurements, you can get a lot of spatial coverage, but it's going to vary with time, right? As a plane flies around and either measures emission fluxes that we can compare to the emissions inventory, or measures in situ measurements of concentrations in the atmosphere. And so it's pros and cons with different measurement platforms. And so we're really combining them all and not looking at them in isolation.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, we have another question in the chat. I'll take that one, and then we do have some hands raised, so I'll move over to those shortly. We had a technical question about calculating the design values. The question here is, in calculating the designation design value, the numbers from the districts currently showing non-attainment are not rounded. However, for the hourly and 24-hour values, rounding is acceptable. This is confusing. Hope someone can explain why rounding is not a consistent practice.
Sure, this is Sylvia Vanderspeck again. I can explain that. It is related to the form of the standard. So when EPA sets a standard, they also set the form of the standard. And so for the 24-hour that standard that you talked about previously, the standard was set at 35. And so basically, there's no decimal point, and so you round for the value to be at 35. For the new PM standard, it was rounded to the 1 decimal point. So the standard is actually 9.0. And so you assess whether someone meets that standard or not if in relationship to 9.0. So for example, if the value was 9.05, they would be over. If it was 9.04, they would be meeting the standard. So it's just conventional rounding.
Thanks, Sylvia. Okay, I'll go to some folks who have their hands raised now. Beverly, you should be able to unmute and begin.
Hi, my name is Beverly Deschaux. I'm with the Electric Vehicle Association of California Central Coast. I have a couple of questions. One is why I want to make sure that I understand, and maybe I misunderstood, that it sounded as if you were saying that aircraft and marine vehicles are not included in your plans. Is that correct? In your monitoring their emissions and controlling their emissions? Do I understand that correctly? And I have two other questions. Should I say all my questions and then you can answer them?
No, I can start with that one. Beverly, this is Mark Hickson with the Central Valley Air Quality Planning section. So aircraft and marine emissions are included in the emission inventories and the modeling that's done for meeting the standard. Certain sources, though, the authority for controlling those sources falls on different agencies. And so that's where maybe some distinction was made on that slide, which agencies have regulatory authority over those sources.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. And I'm curious that I'm glad that you clarified that someone asked the question and you clarified about Portola Valley with the increase in the OA measures during the winter because of wood burning stoves. I'm wondering what specifically it is that's being done to control that.
Sure, this is Sylvia. I can answer that question. So the Portola area is a very small city and it's rural. What's being done is the local district there received a targeted airshed grant from US EPA, and they are paying to change out these old dirty wood stoves. So they're paying for the full cost of changing these stoves out. After the stove is changed out, that old stove is crushed. And so we've seen air quality improvement because of that.
What are they being switched out to? From an old wood stove to a better wood stove, or
an old wood stove to the cleanest wood stove that's out there, and or they're also switching them out to heat pumps where it's appropriate. So we are working with the community there to do that.
Right. Well, so I just say Portola, but it's a problem everywhere. I mean, I'm in the Central Coast and we know there's a problem here. Our air district notices the problem here when people start using their wood stoves as well, even if it's just a fireplace for entertainment rather than heating. So, okay, my last point is that and thank you, I'm glad that you're doing that. And heat pumps, I'm just switching my own self to a heat pump and kicking gas out of my house. I'm never going to turn on my wall heater again. I got a heat pump. So glad that you're doing that. What I wanted to say, I know this isn't about that, but I'm simply commenting because the other person commented. And that's having to do with pesticides. The Central Coast experiences a great deal of pesticide pollution. And there's a group called Safe Ag, Safe Schools. And I started to work with them, but it was so frustrating because I've been knowing about their work for 30 and plus years, with them actually not accomplishing much in the way of actual pesticide reduction. There are rules about the group was started by teachers, and there were rules, and I assume are rules still, about pesticides, a boundary, a buffer zone. That's what it is, a buffer zone between where the pesticides are sprayed and the schools. And it hasn't really been enforced, or it wasn't, I should say, wasn't really enforced. And so they keep coming up against, oh, well, no, you can't do anything locally because we're regulated by the state. And then they meet with the state and nothing really happens. The most that happens is they say, we'll give you notice of when we will spray. And there are actually teachers who have quit because they're noticing the cognitive impairment in the children from the spraying nearby and their own impairment as well. So, and it's affecting everything. The ag industry, I'm just going to say it, is the Wild West. There are issue after issue that they keep not just saying, no, we control ourselves or somebody else controls us and you have no say. So saltwater intrusion because they're over pumping. There are all sorts of issues that the big ag just is the Wild West. That's all I want to say. And so I second the commenter who mentioned about pesticides. And I mean, you know, I know it's not your domain, but whoever's domain it is really needs to do something about pesticide. And I had an idea that in that buffer zone, they could have a pilot of using regenerative agriculture. They say they're afraid because they're not going to make as much money, but they could do a pilot program and see that in fact they could make as much money and they could save our water, our air, our workers, our students, our people everywhere from the pesticide pollution. It is scary. So thank you for listening.
No, thank you very much for your comment and expressing your concerns. You know, we definitely, you know, understand the problems that are out there. So thank you for commenting.
Thanks. All right, we'll go to our next speaker. Tracy, you should be able to unmute now.
Okay. Yeah, hi. In San Diego, there are a very, very large number of bonfires on the beach, sometimes hundreds, that all spew out huge amounts of smoke. And we were just wondering, is that part of your inventory? And would that be a way to actually mitigate the exceedance of the air pollution in San Diego City? And also, are the monitors located in such a place that they would actually pick up the pollution coming from these beach bonfires?
Oh, thank you very much for your comments. You know, San Diego, the local air district is responsible for that. And as we're going through this process right now, we're still in the designation phase. And so when we have the emission inventory, you know, each of these districts will have their own public process along with the state's public process. And, you know, participating in that public process is very important. And the local district, you know, you can participate and influence the controls that are put in place there. And so I really recommend that you do participate in that local process.
Yeah, we've tried to actually contact them, and basically they say it's not some source they're monitoring, and it's something, basically they're very unresponsive on that, and try to push it off on somebody else and pass the buck.
Hey, Tracy, this is Michael Benjamin at CARB. Thanks a lot for raising your concern to us. One of CARB's jobs is to provide oversight of the local air districts and also to ensure that there's consistency in the emissions inventory methods across the state. And so when we hear concerns like this raised, what we do is we will go back and we will look at the inventory methods and we will ensure that sources like this are accounted for. So thank you for raising it. I know that beach bonfires have been a concern, and up north of you in the LA area and the South Coast Air Quality Management District has wrestled with those. And so it's a complaint that we've heard from other parts of California. So we will look into it and we will work with the local air district to make sure that they are accounting for those beach bonfires in their emissions inventory, and that we'll talk with them about how to assess the impacts.
Yeah, that's great, because one of the things they came up with is that they weren't sure whether that was a stationary source or a mobile source. I guess that's something that needs to be resolved.
Well, I'll just tell you it's a stationary source, so.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no need to follow up on that. We have a very clear answer.
Okay.
Unless you have the bonfire in the back of your pickup.
Yeah.
And you're driving around, then that's a different question.
That was one of the responses that we got from them. So yeah. Okay, well, thank you, and thank you for your good work.
All right, we have one more participant with a hand raised, and I will go there now. Cynthia, you should be able to unmute now.
Cynthia with the Central Air Quality Coalition. I just had a clarifying question on the areas exceeding the 9 micrograms standard. Is that like with the exceptionary events taken out, or is that still included in there? I didn't catch that during the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Cynthia. This is Sylvia Vanderspeck. On the slide presentation that showed the table, all of those areas currently have design values that are over the standard. Exceptional events haven't been taken out, but however, exceptional events aren't going to make a difference. So all of those areas currently we're planning to propose to be non-attainment for the standard.
Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia. Okay, I am seeing just one final question, a clarifying question in the chat. I'm not seeing any other attendees with hands raised. So the last question in the chat was a clarifying question about the topic we addressed previously having to do with soil emissions. Very interested in what the speaker said about gases from the soil. Is that from organics decomposing, pesticide residue, et cetera?
Yeah, this is Jeremy Avis. So that's primarily what Ian, I think, had brought up was nitrogen from microbial processes in the soil. So that can be natural. It can occur, in pretty much anywhere, but it can be affected by the application of fertilizers. So applying more nitrogen in the soil can enhance those emissions.
Thanks, Jeremy. Okay, that's all the questions that I'm seeing. I will turn it back over to the room there.
Laura, thank you, Laura, and thanks everyone for participating online. I don't see questions in the room. So unless anyone has last minute questions or comments, I think we can close out. One more hand raised, Laura, is that a new one?
Looks like a person who had already provided a comment. I can go ahead and unmute here. Let's see.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak and voice our comments. I did have a second kind of follow-up question. Was there any discussion about wanting or trying, I will be looking into those specific requirements for the air quality monitors, but I'm wondering if there's any discussion about looking into finding ways to like integrate. I don't know if there's like a heavy price difference between the purple air monitors and the air monitors that 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 you guys have added. But in my community, and I would assume that it's similar in other communities, we only have the 2 air monitors, and they're placed in downtown areas, which are not reflective of what other more rural areas in our community look like, which is the reason why adding these community air monitoring to the system and integrating all of this data would be able to provide more accurate readings and modelings. So I'm just interested in hearing if there's any thoughts on that or any future plans about that type of collaboration and integration of new air monitors. Thank you so much.
Yeah, hi, Laura. This is Michael Benjamin from CARB. So the US EPA, which oversees the administration and the review of state implementation plans, has very clear and strict criteria about what sorts of air monitoring instruments can be used to determine attainment, these so-called regulatory monitors. And there are only specific makes and models of air monitors that meet the very strict accuracy requirements that are needed for attainment purposes or attainment determination. So the Purple Air and other low-cost sensors that many of us are familiar with do not meet these regulatory air monitoring requirements. US EPA is the determining agency when it comes to which monitors can be used for attainment purposes. They are always looking at new technologies and new approaches, including low-cost air sensors. And so at this time, those are not accurate enough for these purposes. Having said that, it doesn't mean that the lower cost monitors aren't valuable in identifying areas where there are pollution levels of concern and that might justify maybe placing a regulatory monitor at some point. So I just wanted to make clear that there is a difference in the accuracy of these monitors, and the lower cost sensors don't meet these regulatory requirements. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
All right, thanks. We had one other question added into the chat, so I'll go to that now. So this one has to do with the San Joaquin Valley. For an area such as the San Joaquin Valley that ranks as the highest in annual PM 2.5 currently and has been in serious non-attainment for the past standards, how much community engagement will be done by the Air District and CARB? It is a high priority area and people should know that we are behind the standards.
This is Michael Benjamin at CARB. So the development of the SIPs is a collaborative process between CARB and the local air districts. In this case, in the San Joaquin Valley, it would be the San Joaquin Valley Air Pollution Control District. We don't dictate the frequency or how they conduct their public workshop process. That is up to them. We support them and we participate in their workshops. We are holding this series of workshops to provide an additional venue in which to provide information to the public and to solicit feedback. This is a dynamic iterative process that we're going through. And so based on feedback that we get from you and others through the process, we may adjust our workshop schedule accordingly to address topics or concerns that perhaps folks feel are not being addressed through the district workshop process. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, we have also had one other person raise their hand, so I'll go ahead and unmute. Okay, Laura, you should be able to unmute.
Yes. Wind should be a factor that should not be just excluded, like heavy windstorms, because they should have fences up and vegetative barriers. Industry should put fences, vegetative barriers, and the state should control land that's just dusty.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, we have also had one other person raise their hand, so I'll go ahead and unmute. Okay, Laura, you should be able to unmute.
Yes.
Thank you for the question, Laura. I think we're getting some feedback on the line there, but I understood your question about considering wind as an exceptional event. And I know that there are some considerations for mitigation around exceptional events, but at least for the exceptional events that we're considering for the PM 2.5 standard, these would be serious events that are unpredictable, so extreme that they would be beyond reasonable control by an area. So there are control measures in place to control dust and the influence of dust for both PM10 and PM2.5, but there are certain meteorological events that might be so severe and so unprecedented that those could be considered exceptional events. But there is an extensive review process anytime we put together a demonstration for an exceptional event that has to go through EPA review, has input from the air district itself. So it's a very high bar to clear the threshold to be an exceptional event. But you're also right that there are control strategies around mitigating wind-blown dust generally in plan. So I hope that helps answer your question.
Thanks, Mark. That's all the questions that I'm seeing. So back to you.
Okay, I think that's everything for today. So I do want to thank everyone for attending online and in person. Again, look to the website that was linked in the notice so that you can access the documents. The webinar itself will be posted there, the slides. Please utilize the email address there for providing feedback. And I don't know if anyone else has any closing thoughts or words. Going to close it out. So thanks everyone and have a good evening.